Well, good morning. Did I turn myself on? I did. Okay. Good morning. Welcome to New Life. Thank you so much for choosing to spend part of your Sunday morning here with us. We know we say this all the time, but we really do mean it. We don't ever take it for granted that you would choose to spend an hour or so of your Sunday morning here with us. There are other places you could be, other things you could be doing. You chose to be here with us, so I'm incredibly grateful for that. I'm also incredibly grateful that you came back after Tyler preached last week. There was some uncertainty about how the confetti cannon would go. He lured you in with the donuts, so that's helpful. I'm going to make use of that again at some point to help gather your attention next time. But thank you so much to Tyler for filling in last week. We super appreciate that. We are going to pick up. Yeah, go ahead. Give him another 2 round of applause 2 weeks in a row. That hasn't happened to me for a while, Tyler. I'm not going to lie. All right. I'm not going to take that personally. We are in the middle of a very long series of messages called The Jesus Project. Maybe that's why I haven't gotten a round of applause in a couple weeks. We are in the middle of a very long series of messages looking at everything that Jesus said and did from the beginning to the end of the Gospels, trying to ask ourselves as best as we possibly can if we could see Jesus for who he is, for instead of who we've maybe made him out to be, or maybe who other people have made him out to be for us in our lives, that we could just kind of strip away all of that stuff. And instead of looking through our lenses and through some of those other filters, that we could just filter Jesus through the one lens that we have, which is these 4 accounts of his life that told us the things that he said and the things that he did, and why they thought those things were so important, were so significant, why they were willing to risk their lives to make the claim that Jesus was the single most important human being who had ever walked on the planet. That they were willing to risk their lives and say that no matter what anyone else said, that Jesus was Lord, Jesus was king over all of the earth, in spite of the fact that Caesar was Lord and king over all of the earth. So what was it about this guy that made people drop everything and follow? Made people drop everything and go where he invited them to go. And this morning we're going to read from Mark chapter 4, and before we get there, let's just talk a little bit about my life, and not so that I can indulge myself, but so that you know this about me, right? Like I just turned 48 years old. I have spent most of my life in church, probably from the time I was 4 or 5 years old, from Sunday school to Sunday morning services, Sunday evening services. You've heard that whole drill at some point or another. I spent a lot of time in church. I learned a lot of Bible stories, and then when I eventually felt called to go into ministry, I went to Bible college, and not only did I spend time in church on Sundays, but we had chapel 4 days a week, Tuesday through Friday. We had and you only got like a couple skips a semester, and they kept track. They kept track of where you were, and you didn't get to sit with the ladies. If you were a gentleman like me, we had separate seating, and we had our uniforms on, we had all that sort of stuff. I spent hours and hours in classes learning about the Bible, learning about the Old Testament, learning about the New Testament, learning about the Gospels, learning about theology, trying to synthesize all of this information together into a coherent sort of view of the world that made sense of the way the world was, made sense of what we believed was true and is true about Jesus. And so I have spent, a long time thinking about, writing about, talking to other people about, and asking myself about this question: what are we going to do with Jesus? I left Bible college. I went right into full-time ministry in a church, and I started writing sermons, and I started writing Sunday school lessons, and then I came here, and I had to write a sermon every single Sunday to answer this question: what are we going to say about Jesus? What's important? And then to some extent or another, I'm almost 24 years in to my ministry here at New Life, and so for 24 years, I've been trying to ask and answer this question: what difference does Jesus make in my life, and what difference does Jesus make in your life? And if I were to be real honest, I would tell you that there are moments, because of just my nature. My nature is a little bit of I've said before, I'm a nerd. I proudly embrace that. I am I like to spend a lot of time in my own head. I've said before, I have great conversations with myself inside of my own head. I don't always need someone else to engage in the conversation. I'm totally fine with it. And so because of the way that I am, and having spent all of this time, there is a tendency for me, even as a follower of Jesus at 48 years old, been doing this for as long as I can possibly remember, there's a tendency for me to be fascinated with information about Jesus rather than being actually fascinated with Jesus himself. There's a tendency to sort of, and Tyler talked a little bit about this last week, to intellectualize and sort of spend a lot of time up here in my brain thinking about facts and information and ways to present and ways to talk about and ways to communicate about Jesus to other people. And sometimes in the middle of that, I have forgotten, I'll just be completely honest, I've forgotten to just know who Jesus is. And what I've found in my life is this, that knowing Jesus is better than just knowing about Jesus. Knowing Jesus for who he is and having an actual relationship with Jesus is way better than just knowing a bunch of facts and information about Jesus. And part of the way that we have approached this series of messages is to give us a lot of information. I've tried to do as best as I can to sort of give you a lot of context and give you a lot of background and give you a lot of things for you to think about that maybe you've never thought about before when it comes to Jesus. And because of the way that we have chosen to approach this series, it is absolutely possible for us to know a lot about Jesus and to not really know him for ourselves. And one of the things that you find in the Gospels is that the Gospels are filled with stories that tell us these things about Jesus. They tell us, Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, they tell us the stories. Here is what Jesus did. And we've tried to fill in some of the symbolism and try to fill in some of the meaning behind and try to give you some of the context behind how they might have seen what Jesus was doing when Jesus healed people and when Jesus drove out demons. And then here are the things that Jesus said. And here's some of what might have been ringing around inside people's hearts and minds when they heard Jesus say the kinds of things that Jesus said. And so we've tried to give you all of that context and all of that information, and the gospel writers give us all of that. And then every once in a while, they give us these little stories where it is incredibly clear that Jesus is looking at a group of people or a person in particular and saying, I don't want you to just know about me. I want you to know who I am for yourself. I need you to not just rely on the information that you have accumulated and gathered over a series of, encounters with me and things that you've watched me say and do. And I want you instead to actually have an experience with me for yourself. And if you have an experience with me for yourself, then something fundamentally shifts inside of you, and it becomes not just an academic pursuit, it becomes the pursuit of your life to follow and to know Jesus. And this morning, the passage that we're going to read from is one of those places where I think Jesus is looking at a particular group of people, his disciples, as we'll see in a few minutes, his disciples, and saying, I know you know about me. You've seen the signs, you've seen the wonders, you've experienced the miracles, you've heard all of the teachings, the parables, the stories that we talked about over the last few weeks. And yet, I'm not sure you actually know who I am. This morning, part of the passage that we're reading from has a lot of Old Testament echoes, and we've talked about this over the course of this series, which is that the gospel writers are at times really deliberately making use of stories that would have been familiar to their audience to make sure that their audience could see and understand who Jesus was. They give us all of this sort of background information about Jesus. One of the stories that's standing behind the one that we're going to read this morning is the story of Jonah. We talked about this maybe a month or so ago when Jesus talked to the Pharisees and said, I'm only going to give you the sign of Jonah. We talked a little bit about the story of Jonah. We're going to recap the story of Jonah in one slide this morning. One slide this morning, just the beginning of the Jonah story. Here's how it goes. But the Lord, you know this part, the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea. This is after Jonah refuses to go where God sends him to go. The Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. And so the captain said to him, when he goes down and visits and says, hey, what are we going to do about this? He says, what do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps your God, the God, will give a thought to us so that we may not perish. Because if nothing happens, if this ship continues to experience this storm, this tempest on the sea, the ship is going to break apart and we're all going to die. So the best thing that you can do, Jonah, is you can do what we're all doing, which is we're all praying to our gods. We're making the sacrifices, the offerings, all that sort of stuff. And Jonah says to the captain, here's the problem. I'm the problem. If you were to throw me overboard, I serve the God who is the Lord of heaven and earth and the Lord of the wind and the waves. And if you were to throw me overboard, the sea would become calm. And so they picked Jonah up and they hurled him into the sea. And they said, thank you, Jonah, for giving us that little piece of information. And the sea ceased its raging. That's the story, and I don't think it'll be hard for us to see it. That's standing a little bit in the background of the one that we're going to read this morning from Mark chapter 4, beginning in verse 35. And here's how it begins. On that day, when the evening had come, Jesus said to them, let us go across to the other side. They're down by the Sea of Galilee again. This is where most of Jesus' early ministry takes place. And leaving the crowd, they took him with him in the boat just as he was. And other boats were with him, and a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling, but he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. Do you hear the echoes already of the story that we just read, right? And the way that Mark paints the picture is, this is right after Jesus has spent the day teaching a crowd of people. The different parables that we went through, those parables, those kingdom stories that Jesus had told. It's possible that even in his sort of description of what Jesus had done, that Jesus had spent some time healing people in the morning, had moved on to teaching people at the end of the day. And then by the time he gets to this point, he is completely and utterly exhausted, completely and utterly spent. And he says to the disciples, it's time for us to get up and to go over to the other side of the sea. Let's go back home. Let's get some rest. Let's get some recovery. And the way that Mark describes it bears all of the marks of an eyewitness account. Most people assume that Mark got his information from Peter, who would have been in the boat with Jesus in this occasion. And leaving the crowd, they all gather Jesus together, and they take him. And the way that Mark says it, he says, just as he was. And I puzzled over what that meant. And I thought, maybe there's some, weird significance to it. And here's what I came to, this real startling conclusion, that Jesus was tired, and they just grabbed him and said, let's get in the boat. Let's get away from this group of people because you are exhausted. And I think sometimes we don't give enough credence and credit to the idea that Jesus could have just been wiped out by a long day of dealing with people. Anybody? Like, just no more people. Just no more. Just give me a minute. If you're an introvert, you totally understand. If you're an extrovert, you're like, I've never felt that in my entire life. Just give me, where are the people? Why do they not keep coming to me? And again, even the way Mark describes it, it says other boats were with him, and a great windstorm arose. The boat was already filling, and here's Jesus asleep in the stern of the boat on the cushion. And again, the reference is to this idea that there was a little place in the back of a boat that if you were not part of the crew that was rowing the boat, that was not responsible for moving the boat from point A to point B, you got out of the way and you could sort of lay down in the back. And this is where they put Jesus. Jesus falls asleep on the cushion and is passed out in the middle of this storm. In a boat, they've done some archaeological sort of excavation around the Sea of Galilee, obviously, because people are super concerned with what happened in that time and in that space. In a boat that was probably about somewhere like 20 to 25 feet long and 7 feet wide, you've got the disciples in a small little shallow boat, Jesus sleeping on the cushion, trying to get from one side to the lake to the other. And in this place, it is completely normal for these storms to whip up on the Sea of Galilee that would have caught these experienced fishermen who had spent a lot of time on that sea themselves completely by surprise. The boat is filling. The boat is threatening to break up. And they're looking at Jesus still asleep on the cushion in the back, and at some point or another, I don't know who it was, we'll just assume it was Peter, because he seems to be the guy, who says, hey, maybe we should wake up Jesus. Maybe, we should, sort of inform him of the situation that has arisen on the sea, that is putting us in danger, that makes us feel like, hey, remember that Jonah story and the ship was breaking up, and call out on your God. Maybe Jesus can do something about this. And they woke him and they said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And you can forgive these guys for being desperately afraid in the middle of their circumstance and situation. Because if you are a person who is experienced enough to know your way around the storms, know your way around the lake, you are not the sort of person who's going to overreact to something that's not really that life-threatening. So we can assume that about these guys, at least 4 or 5 of them, are not the kind of people who are going to dramatically overreact and say, we're going to die. You know people like that too. We're all going to die. No, you're probably going to be fine. Fine. But these guys are legitimately afraid for their lives. And just as legitimately, Jesus is passed out on the cushion in the back of the boat saying, I've spent all day working with people. I've spent all day trying to take care of people. I've spent all day healing and teaching and healing and teaching and talking and enough already. Just let me take a nap. And these two completely normal pieces come together. Jesus asleep on the cushion, and these disciples in a boat who are afraid for their lives. And when they express their fear for their lives, the way they say it to Jesus is this: Teacher, do you not care that we're about to die? And interestingly, right, their fear leads them to a wrong conclusion, which it almost always does for us. Their fear for their lives, their fear for that moment, that situation, the circumstance that they find themselves in, leads them to a conclusion about Jesus that's completely wrong. And they look at Jesus and they say, Jesus, you obviously don't care. Because if you cared, you would wake up and you would do something. You would have already woken up. You would have already done something about this. We would never get into this circumstance. We would never get into this situation if you actually cared about us. Does that sound familiar to any of you? Have you ever had a moment? Just present this as a question, but I think I know the answer. Have you ever had a moment where you looked at God and you asked, do you even care? Have you ever had a moment in your life where you were like, I'm not sure. I know all the information. I know all the stories. I've seen the signs. At this point, they've seen all of it. They've seen Jesus heal the sick, make the lame to walk, cause the blind to see, teach the crowds of people the word and the message about the kingdom of heaven. And they find themselves in a situation where their information about Jesus is insufficient. Their fear leads them to the wrong conclusion. They say the same kinds of things that we say. God, if you were concerned about me, this wouldn't be happening. There's a gap between what I know about you and what I'm experiencing of you in this moment. And usually when there's a gap between what we know about God and what we experience in this moment, we allow our fear to lead us to the wrong conclusion. The conclusion that we reach is similar to the one that they reached. Lord, if you cared about us, you would do something. We would not be perishing. This would not be happening. This experience in my life, this person would be healed. This person wouldn't be sick. This relationship would have been restored. This job wouldn't have been lost. This house, all of that sort of things that we get ourselves so wrapped up with and so concerned with. None of this bad stuff would be happening to me if you cared. And they wake Jesus with all of their information. And Jesus awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Sound familiar from the story that we read at the beginning? Except, here's the difference. The captain of Jonah's boat says, "Wake up and call on your God. Perhaps your God will save us in this moment." Wake up, oh sleeper, what are you doing? Wake up, call on your God. Perhaps your God will be concerned enough about us that he would rescue us from the circumstance and the situation that we are in. And when the disciples wake up Jesus, wake up. Don't you care that we are perishing? What they could have expected is for Jesus to call out to God and say, "God, would you rescue us from this situation? Would you rescue us from this circumstance, from this moment, from this definite peril that threatens our lives?" And no one in the boat would have had any issue with Jesus saying, "God is the God of the heavens and the earth. God is the God of the wind and the waves. And if anyone can make this ship safe, if anyone can restore calm to this sea, if anyone can speak to the wind and to the waves and make them stop, it is the God of heaven and earth, the Lord of the wind and the waves." And then Jesus speaks to the wind and the waves. And Jesus says, "Hush." That's kind of the translation of it. Just sort of hush. Just quiet. Be still. Peace. The Psalms repeatedly refer to God as the Lord of heaven and earth, the maker of everything that we see. God who rides the winds and makes the waves calm, takes the tempest and brings peace out of chaos. And now here's Jesus in the back of a boat, some fishermen from Galilee, scared to death, and he doesn't call out, "Heavenly Father, please still the wind and the waves." It's just his word. "Peace, be still." And then he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no trust?" Why are you afraid? Well, Jesus, I don't know if you saw. Here's why we are so afraid. Here's what's happening. Here's a circumstance. Here's a situation that I find myself in, here's this aspect of my life that is chaotic, that is untamed, that has fallen or is falling apart, that threatens to break up my life and overwhelm me. Why are you so afraid? And then he says this question, and I think sometimes, again, we hear Jesus and we think that he's got, and sometimes he does have a little bit of an edge to him, but I don't know if in this moment it's such a, why do you have no faith kind of question. I think it's more like a, why don't you trust me? Why didn't you trust? You've seen all the things that I did. You've experienced so much with me already. You've watched me do so much for so many other people. Why are you so afraid? Why didn't you trust? Why didn't you just allow your faith to reach out towards me? And instead of being terrified in the circumstances and in the moment that you found yourself in, why didn't you just trust that I would take care of it? Why don't you trust? Why didn't you believe? Why didn't you take all of the information that was available to you about me and translate it over into a moment where you could personalize it, where you could individualize it, where you could make it your own, not just for someone else out there experiencing something else, but for you experiencing what you're experiencing in this moment, not just for the sick people I've already healed, but for you while you're in the boat that threatens to break up. Why couldn't you just trust? Why don't you just believe? And I don't think, again, it's Jesus rebuking them and telling them they're terrible disciples. I think it's Jesus always extending the invitation and saying, I want you to learn from this. Because if you could see this for what it is, you would see this as a moment in which God is inviting your trust in me. God's extending the opportunity for you to let go of your disbelief, let go of your wrong interpretations about Him, and instead place your trust fully in me. And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? Who's the guy in the boat? Because that guy in the boat just did what we would expect our God to do with just His word. That guy in the boat just did what happened when the sailors threw Jonah over into the sea because he was running away from God, the creator of heaven and earth, the Lord of the wind and the waves and the sea. And all of the stuff that just happened, that we just experienced, it happened because of him in the boat, and they were afraid of who's in the boat. We don't often think about that as being the first response to Jesus. They're terrified. Because what would it mean, right, for them to be walking around with the person who could speak to the wind and waves like they would expect their God to do, and the wind and waves would obey? Well, that changes the conversation a little bit. And Mark was very straightforward. If you were here at the beginning of the series, Mark says right from the beginning, here's my story. In Mark chapter 1, this is the story of Jesus, the Son of God. And then what he does is he proceeds to tell the story of how it was that men and women came to believe that that was true about Jesus. And as he stacks up the stories and says, here's another one, and here's another one, and here's another one, and then he gets to this one, and again, for these disciples, this isn't an information about Jesus. This is an experience for themselves that they can't deny. We were in the boat, threatened with our lives, and Jesus spoke to the sea. And Jesus spoke to the wind. And when he spoke to the wind and spoke to the sea, everything was still. And if that's the case, then who is this? And Mark has told the story, and he told us, again, he told everybody at the beginning, here's the giveaway. But then he describes the process by which men and women came to that conclusion. And one of the ways they came to that conclusion is they had moments where it was not about information. It was about something that they experienced that they could not deny. And most of what happened that they could not deny scared them to death. It got them to a place where they recognized if Jesus comes through, then everything is okay. And if he does not, then nothing's okay. Most of us spend our lives trying to get out of circumstances and situations that scare us to death, don't we? I mean, you do, I do. Some of you are fight, and some of you are flight. But either way, your mechanism kicks in, and it tells you, this is not a circumstance that you want to be in. And when you find yourself in that circumstance, your fight and flight mechanism takes over, right? And some of you just absolutely have it out with God. You like hands up, words up, whatever it is, right? We're going to have it out. And some of you decide just to run away. And your flight mechanism says, I don't want anything to do with this. And I know this is difficult, but here's, I think, what the story today suggests, is that it's in that place where your fear threatens to lead you to the wrong conclusion that you should ask this question. Who is this? Who's this Jesus? It's in the boat with me. And if he could speak to the wind and to the waves for people like that, then what will he do for me? That is a difficult question. That's a question that requires the courage to not flee and not fight, but instead to trust and surrender to him in that place. Why are you so afraid? Why do you not trust? And here's what Jesus is saying to us today. Why are you so afraid? Why are you allowing your fear to lead you to the wrong conclusion? Why won't you just trust me? Would you pray with me this morning? Jesus, that sounds so simple to say, and it is so incredibly difficult to do. When we are faced with our greatest fears, whatever those fears are, and they, I think, look different for all of us. And when we're faced with those experiences in our lives that threaten to break apart the ship that we find ourselves in, it makes it feel really frail and fragile and really dangerous. Our tendency is to fight or to flee. Jesus, I pray that this morning we would hear you speaking to us, reminding us that we don't need to be afraid if you are there with us. And that in the midst of that place, that you bring peace. And so to us this morning, some of us who find ourselves in the middle of chaos that we can't tame, that we can't manage, that we can't make better, I pray that we would find the courage to surrender to you. and that you would meet us there. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.